Hey everyone, I just want to go over the midterm quiz/review that you took a couple weeks ago. I want to make sure that we're on the same page and understand why the correct answers were correct. So I thought this webcast might be helpful. I do suggest, though, before continuing farther, that you get into your quiz tool, go to your first attempt, and write down all the questions that you missed. That way, as we go through them, you can pay extra attention to those questions that you missed the first time through. I know a lot of you did a great job of taking it multiple times and kind of quizzing yourself to mastery, which is the intent. But it doesn't highlight what your confusions were. You just learned kind of what the right answer was and which button to click. So I want to make sure we really are set before this final exam. So go ahead and do that and then unpress pause. All right, so I'm going to start with question 1. And we're just going to go through them question by question, try and look at some of the different options and explain why things are not correct or are correct. So a common wildlife management tool for aging deer. This goes back to that lab we did with a lot of stations. So yeah, looking at the wear on the teeth. Some other questions that might stem from that, though, would be how does the habitat affect the wear on the teeth, right? So animals that might be living in a more sandy, soiled environment and nipping grass, they may be grinding their teeth down more than animals that don't have that kind of soil in their mouth as they're chewing. So that's kind of a side note. Points on an antler, that gives you an indication of an age range, right? But it's not absolute, because that curve kind of is steady, but then it kind of plateaus out. They don't indefinitely get larger and larger antlers, but it can help for, maybe ages 1 to 5 or 6 until an animal's in its prime, for sure. And then they might just be putting on growth and so forth. Radio telemetry, sorry. The only thing that helps with is if you have an animal tagged or collared and then you recapture them and you know they're at least 5 years old because you caught them 5 years later, but it's not going to give you a total age. Okay, number 2, really don't get scared by the math. This is as easy as it gets. This is not the full-on calculation that we ask you to do for a mark recapture survey, where you're really getting an average of what percentage is getting recaught each year. If you're just looking at it one time and you know that you have 25, let's say, elk that have radio collars on. You went out last summer, you collared 25 elk, you put them out in the herd, and you now do a flyover and you count 20 animals that have the collars. You're still assuming that there's 25 out there. You're not worried about death rate or anything like that. This is a very rough calculation. So if you assume there's 25 collared animals in the population, because that's how many you put there and you think they're still there, you count 20. You counted 20 out of 25 of your little subsample, right? So that's 80%. So 0.8, 20 divided by 25 is 0.8 or 80%. So then let's say you said, okay, so how many animals are actually in the population? If you counted, and I can't do the math in my head, but if you counted, let's say 50 individuals, you would assume that the 50 you counted was 80% of the overall population. So give me a second. Okay, I just had to cheat for a minute and use a calculator. So if you have 50 and you assume that you have 0.8 of the whole population was sampled, right? So 0.8 of X being your population that you don't know, equals 50. Then you take 50, you divide by that 0.8, and you get 62.5, or let's say 63. You'd say we have 63 individuals in the population. So that's a quick and dirty method for a one and done look at how many animals might be out there. Okay, an example of a wildlife species considered a specialist. So a specialist, remember, is an animal that has very specific, hence the word, requirements for either food or habitat. Most of the time we really talk about it in regards to food, though. So if you want to just kind of key into that, if they have a specialized habitat, it probably goes back to their food. So a lynx has a very specific diet, right? They eat primarily snowshoe hare. They will on occasion eat squirrels and such if hare aren't available, but usually you're going to see a population decline if hare aren't available. So the lynx then would be a specialist because it feeds primarily on snowshoe hare. Coyote on the other extreme is a generalist. No better example of a generalist than a coyote. They can eat whatever, they can live wherever, they adapt easily. The other thing about your lynx is that they don't adapt very well to new situations, new foods, new environments, whatever you might consider. Bears, most of the time omnivores are not specialists because they have such a wide diet. Now, they can be a habitat specialist, and a polar bear, for example, would definitely be a habitat specialist. And as you see a decline in their habitat, you're going to see a decline in the polar bear. They're not going to just shift to another area like a coyote would if you got rid of their prime area. Prairie dogs. Now, a lot of people put prairie dogs. The prairie dog is obligate to a grassland system and does have some specific requirements of where it can live. But we don't usually call a prairie dog a specialist. We call them more of a keystone species or an ecosystem engineer. But if they ate just one type of grass or only grass and no forbs and no shrubs, then maybe we could throw them into that specialist category. But we don't based on just the fact that they need grasslands. That would make pronghorn and everybody else a specialist, and it's just not the case. Now, animals that rely on prairie dog colonies, that is a more unique habitat, right? It's not the whole grassland, it's just where the prairie dog town is. Your burrowing owl, your black-footed ferret, some amphibian species, reptile species, maybe not amphibian. Those might be specialists because they need just that prairie dog habitat. Okay, an island population, and why is it at risk for extinction? Now, I'm going to be quite honest, if this question appears on your final, it's not going to look just like this because I don't like my options specifically, but let's talk through it. So why is an island population an island? You have a couple different population types, island and meta populations. So a meta population means you have a group of animals here, and a small distance away you have another group of animals and another group of animals. 3 different populations within this broader area. And if something happens to population A, then somebody from B or C is probably going to refill in. Like with the sage grouse that Sarah was talking about in that presentation. But when you have a population down here, and usually there's some geographic or physical barrier in between your meta population and your island population, the chances of immigration are extremely low. Not impossible, but so low that you can't count on immigration to refill that population if that population becomes extinct. So the best answer of why that island population is at risk for extinction, and we're not talking about why are certain animals going to die, right? Like disease or flooding or whatever it might be. But we're saying, okay, this whole thing is going to get wiped out because you can't refill it with the meta population. So the best answer in this is that there is a very small chance of immigration. All right, that's your first choice there. Now looking at the rest of these, increased susceptibility to negative chance encounters. That just kind of, that was straight from the lecture, but that just means that when you're all alone and you have only, a small genetic pool and you've been isolated for a long time, the odds are you're not going to be as adaptable to disease, to habitat loss, to some freak event. And so you're going to have a bigger chance of dying out. Yes, flooding could be a freak event, and so a lot of people put that. I give a lot of partial credit on this question. But I wouldn't say that just because you're an island population doesn't make you more at risk to flooding. All right, so that's why I didn't select that as a correct answer. Increased risk of disease, however, your disease risk is a bigger deal because usually your island populations have a smaller genetic pool to be able to resist diseases. and you don't have, if the populations start to dwindle because a lot of them get killed by disease, nobody's moving in and refilling it. So the key there is to make sure you understand what an island population is and a meta population, and kind of how that relates to immigration and emigration. Oh, I should mention that. Remember, immigration with an I is animals moving into your population. Emigration with an E is animals moving out of your population. Okay. 2 factors that will cause a population to grow. This is just straight terminology, right? So immigration, emigration, just went over that. Natality and mortality. Natality is birth rate. Mortality is death rate. So how are you going to get more animals? You're going to give birth to more, or they're going to move in. Now, I don't love this question. Now, it's correct, immigration and natality, but then you throw in that concept of recruitment. If you don't have animals recruiting into your population, that means that they were born, but they don't survive in order to reproduce the following reproductive season or whenever they otherwise would have. You're not going to increase your population, right? Just through, without immigration. So the best answer should be recruitment, but I want to make sure you understand natality. So you have to have them born in order for them to survive, but then you have to have them survive to recruit into the population. Okay, many elk calves die in the spring. Okay, this one is going straight back to that lab again, where you looked at mortalities of elk calves in a sampling year, and you looked at when they died and why they died, and you had to make some assumptions. And so the answer, let's just go there, is elk are at their lowest fitness in the spring. So first of all, what is fitness? Fitness is overall body condition, their ability to survive, right? I mean, fitness technically is also their ability to survive and reproduce, but let's just talk about survival for this part. So fitness means that they have good body condition. So if you think about an ungulate species, they have to eat all summer and then put on enough fat that the low amount of food available, and even the food that is available to them in the winter, it's very poor quality because it's the new growth that gives the best protein, that gives some of their essential nutrients. High in nitrogen, has protein, and so forth. Even though there's leaves out there, decadent, old, browning leaves are food, but they're not as nutritionally valuable to the elk or the deer or the pronghorn or whatever it is. So all winter long, they may be eating, but they're losing weight. They're losing weight all winter long. And come spring, they're holding on until that new growth starts up again. So there's a couple reasons why you get these big die-offs. One is because the calves, if you think about the young, they started from nothing. They had to grow. Their body's putting a lot of energy into growing. So of the nutrition they're getting, they're also having to put on, size. And so they don't have those stores of fat to rely on that the adult animals would have. The adult animals have the ability to kind of rely on years of fat reserves to make it through the winter. So you have a much higher mortality of calves than of adults in the spring, but all mortality is generally higher in the spring. The other thing in Colorado especially, and this is specific to our climate, is that just when they're hanging on, they're like, it's come March and their bodies are in really poor condition. And then what happens in March or April, like this year, or May, like a couple years ago, so we get these massive dumps of snow. And all of a sudden, not only are they nutritionally stressed at that time of year, now they're having to fight through a winter snowstorm at the beginning of the growing season. And that's just additional energy, so they die. A lot of people put there are mountain lions to kill, or more mountain lion kills. There may be a higher mortality of mountain lion deaths at this time of year, but it's more of a compensatory mortality where they were not doing well and they were going to die because they don't have the nutrition, and so they're easier prey for the mountain lion. But so instead of dying to starvation, the mountain lion just kills them anyway. It's not because there's more mountain lions on the landscape. There's no more mountain lions on the landscape in spring. It's just that maybe the prey is easier to catch. So that might explain why mountain lion mortality might be higher at that time of year, but it doesn't mean that more calves are dying because of mountain lions. More calves are dying because they don't have the food and they either starve or get eaten. Hunters harvest ungulates in the fall, so you should all know that. And they also wean from their mothers in late summer, early fall. Okay, concerning the prediction of wolf numbers prior to the reintroduction in Yellowstone, this one goes back to another assignment and also a reading. Make sure that you have touched up on all the assignments that I've given and comments that I made to you. But remember, they predicted mortality in elk when they reintroduced wolves because wolves eat elk. And that was the prediction. And then they had like way more animals die than what they thought. And it wasn't because more were getting eaten. It was because elk were having to change their behavior. They were having to hide more. They were having to spend less time camped in that nice big green open meadow just eating at the all-you-can-eat buffet. I mean, think about it as like you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet and you're allowed to just sit there all day through 3 meals. Or is the waiter going to come and say, move along, you got to go, right? You're going to eat more if you're allowed to just stay put. In the non-human world, eating more equates to living longer, right? We aren't really on par with that, but and so more died because they probably died due to winter starvation, and they don't go into those reasons in the article, but that's what they didn't account for. And that's an important concept, right? Because our predators impact our prey populations in multiple ways, directly through killing them, but also indirectly from changing their behaviors. And that's important. When we were talking about in this week's assignment, you were to look at elk in Rocky Mountain National Park, and they wanted to fence off those riparian areas. That's changing their behavior. It's keeping them from camping in that one spot, just degrading that habitat. And it's going to keep that elk population moving. They haze them. They do other things to try and keep them moving, because keeping them moving is better for the habitat. It makes the elk cost more energy, but that helps keep their populations at a more natural level. Okay, mule deer. This one, you guys. Oh wait, no, this isn't where we're at. Mule deer are likely to starve to death or killed by predators. I kind of already covered that, right? So that's compensatory mortality. Additive mortality would be like, okay, no, the mule deer was in excellent physical condition in the fall, and they got killed by a lion instead. That would be additive mortality. Recruitment, I just threw in some options there. Recruitment has nothing to do with mortality, and basically this was a 50-50 shot, hopefully, for most of you. Okay, which of the following are the 2 most likely causes? This is where I thought we were. We did an entire lesson on this, and you had to read several articles and several points of view. And you need to go back and look at my comments too on this, and if I wasn't very detailed, then listen carefully. There are a lot of reasons mule deer die. There's a lot of possibilities out there, and everything on here, except for maybe competition with whitetail, because we're dealing with western Colorado and whitetail are not very prevalent over there. But everything else on here is a possibility for why deer die. Don't stop listening there. The studies looked at 2 major causes of death, and that was winter food availability and predation. All right, those are the correct answers there. If a mule deer doesn't have food to make it through winter, they're not going to reproduce that next spring. Population's going to go down. They're going to die, and their offspring won't ever become. If animals eat them, same thing, right? But overall habitat loss, although that is occurring on the western slope, it just hasn't been the focus of this. And they're finding like that's not enough to be driving the populations down, all right? Not to mention when the animals are dying. Disease, CWD definitely is a disease that affects mule deer. Again, it's not what this assignment focused on. It's not what the West Slope has really focused on. In fact, CWD is most prevalent on the eastern plains in Colorado. It's much less prevalent on the western slopes, so that's not the issue. Okay, so we narrow it down to those two reasons, winter food and predation. Remember, they looked at different studies, and some would say, oh, it suggests that it's winter food, and others say, oh, we suggest that it's predation. And some of you in that assignment, I could tell, and I'm remembering this now, you made up your mind what the reasons were before you read the evidence. And you just went with it, and you just tried to convince me that you were right. Read the evidence. I kind of suggest you guys just re-look at those. If you didn't get full points on that assignment, please re-look at it and have an open mind to that. So what did they do? Okay, so some of the studies said we could reduce the number of predators, and if predation is the problem, we're going to see an increase in deer, right? But if predation's not the problem, if food still is, they're still all going to die off in the spring, and we've killed the predators and we still don't have deer. And they've done studies kind of looking at that, and sometimes that's what it points to. Hey, it's just winter food. The other thing you could do is just go, okay, if winter food's the problem, we're going to supplementally feed them through the winter. And if that's the problem, the population's going to go up. But if they're still dying, they're still getting eaten, then it's predation. And remember, the predators are going to eat those starving animals probably first. They're the easiest ones to capture. And so that's kind of how you can test those two things. So this is super controversial, guys, because the research hasn't been real clear. And so, and it's coming up here, right here. I'm going to skip to question 11. So what did CPW do? This was about a year or two ago now. They came out and said, well, we're going to run a very large scale experiment, and we're going to take out mountain lions and bears, because we think mountain lions and bears are killing the deer. And if they are, we're going to see an increase in deer. If it's really winter food, we're not going to see an increase. But that's the choice they made. And so what they ended up doing is they killed a whole ton of lions and bears. It's caused lawsuits. It's caused a lot of tension and dissension. And I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. They're not saying that it's not the right thing to do. Just letting you know that's what they did. And we won't get into the philosophy of all of it. It was, I mean, I'll just say it was a very political decision. That does have some biological evidence to support it, but so does the countermeasures, or counter arguments. Okay, then we have different types of competition. Intra means you're competing within your own species. Intra means within. Inter means between, two different, okay? And so just know that intra, within, inter, I like to think of interstates, between two states, right? So between two species. If mule deer are competing with whitetail, it's inter-specific. If they're competing with elk, it's inter. But if it's mule deer with mule deer, it's intra. Okay, a lot of people missed this one. Maybe just, I don't know. I think I remember checking, and very few people actually even watched this because I didn't make it a part of the assignment. But it's really important for you to know. The very first video of the semester was on the history. And you now are pretty good at listening to videos, hopefully, so go back and re-listen to that. Migratory Bird Treaty Act was our first international piece of legislation. CITES was an international agreement, but that came a little bit later. Endangered Species Act was originally just within our borders. It then branched out into CITES. And the Lacey Act was just a national piece of legislation that prohibited interstate commerce, so it put an end to market hunting, which is your next question. But the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they started noticing that if animals, like our bird populations, were declining, and we could put in regulations in just the United States, but if they're wintering in Mexico and they're summering in Canada, and it's a full-on take everybody you want off the nest, steal their eggs, steal their feathers, kill the animals, we're not going to have them in the United States either. So the three countries eventually came to an agreement. I think that the original one was just Canada and the U.S. Okay, question 13. Market hunting was largely ended because of the Lacey Act. I just went over that. You might see Pittman-Robertson Act again. Remember, that was the one that put the excise tax on hunting and fishing equipment so that we could pay for wildlife. And then the Dingell-Johnson Act, which is just super fun to say, that one was on fishing gear and supplies for waterfowl and fish, anything aquatic. Actually, waterfowl was probably Pittman Robertson too. Okay, in class we discussed that wildlife management boils down to managing people and managing habitat. If you don't learn anything else in this class, I really hope that you learn those two things. Fecundity versus natality. So natality is your birth rate, but your fecundity is your potential for having offspring. If your nutritional quality is down, you may not have a calf or a fawn. But your fecundity hasn't changed. Your potential reproductive rate hasn't changed. And then remember, I already discussed recruitment. So recruitment is number getting added to the population, the breeding population. So if a moose population has cows who produced 1 calf a year, but the calves weren't surviving, the natality is still 1, right? We don't really know what their fecundity was. We don't know. It's not given in here. And the calves didn't survive, so the recruitment is 0. So we're here in this one, it's C, a natality of 1 and a recruitment of 0. Okay, this is called mark recapture. The student got it correct. There's a wildlife management technique in which you capture a sample of the population, put some kind of identifying characteristic on them. That might be an ear tag, it might be a collar, it might be whatever. Then you put them back in the population and you go back out and count again, and however many you count, that's an estimate of the whole population, just like we studied back in the first couple of questions. So this answer is mark recapture. And the second part of this question, which makes sure you read questions thoroughly, this asks for 2 things. Said, what's the technique and what information can you get? All right, and it really wasn't worth 2 points, so sorry about that. But the information you can get is the population estimate. That's what you can get. You guys made up all kinds of other crap that you could get out of there, but just the marking and just looking at them. Well, I didn't tell you what kind of marking you're doing. If you're putting collars on them, sure, you can get a lot more information, but I didn't tell you any additional information. Okay. 17, again, going back to the very first couple of videos that I'm not sure a lot of people watched, but values. The 3 primary values in North America are recreational, economic, and aesthetic. I don't think we need to go into that too much more. 18, fundamental niche versus realized niche. So remember, your fundamental niche is what's a niche? First of all, the role an animal plays in its environment. Where, how, when, all of those things. What does the animal do in its environment? So fundamentally, your niche might be this big, utilizing every resource within it anytime you want. All right? Now, you introduce some interspecific competition. Let's say coyotes versus wolves, because that's what was used in your assignment. Now, if I'm a coyote and I was using all of these resources any time of the day, wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted, wolf comes in and says, oh, no, you didn't. And then they can't use everything anymore because big bad wolf's there growling at them. They might either just stay here, or they might become active when the wolves are sleeping, or they might switch and start eating something different and still utilizing the same area. So it's not about area, but it can be, but it's about the niche. So a realized niche will change possibly with interspecific competition, but a fundamental niche won't. All right, so the correct answer here was false. The fundamental niche is not determined by the competition. It's just determined by the biology of the species and what that species can do. Okay, as a wildlife manager, which of the following can be used to increase the wildlife population when it's at its carrying capacity? Oh my gosh, remember the carrying capacity. This is fundamental wildlife management. Your habitat can support so many animals, above which they're going to die off because you've exceeded your carrying capacity. Now, what sets your carrying capacity? Your limiting factors. That might be food, it might be space, it might be shelter, it might be water, it might be disease, it might be hunters, it might be predation, it might be something. But whichever one is exhibiting the biggest force on that population is going to set where the carrying capacity is. So, rule number 1, you want to figure out how to increase your population? You first have to identify the limiting factor. A lot of people did stuff like this. Well, just give them more area or give them more food. or give them more whatever. You can't. Remember the mule deer and the predation. If food isn't the limiting factor, we can winter feed all we want, and the bears and the cougars are going to go, thanks, I have fatter deer to eat now. They're the limiting factor, right? It doesn't matter how much more food we get. We're not going to increase our population. So, easy peasy answer. Determine your limiting factor and remove it. And that doesn't mean your population goes haywire. It just moves up to that next most limiting factor. Remember the hole in the bucket? And as soon as you plug a hole, the water raises just to the next hole. Okay. Which of the following would be examples of ways you can manipulate succession? Select all that apply. Burning an area creates a disturbance to increase the amount of grass and forbs on the landscape. Yeah, what are you doing there? You're setting the cereal stage back to an earlier cereal stage. Maybe a pioneer community, maybe something just past that, but you're setting it back. And if you have a species that loves that new growth, new forage, then you've just made better habitat for that species. Deer love that, right? Let's keep with the deer, I guess. They love that. Now, if I want to plant trees after disturbance, if I have a forest interior species, I can plant trees. That's going to improve habitat for an animal that wants a later cereal stage. Maybe it's a bird species. And so what have I done? I've changed the habitat. I've changed what stage in succession it's in to benefit wildlife. So that would still work too. If I want to prevent a disturbance, if I have a forest and I say, no, if we cut this forest down, I'm going to set the cereal stage back. And the wildlife I'm managing for doesn't want that, so I don't want to do that. I want to keep it in this cereal stage. I'm manipulating it, right? I'm keeping something from happening. Maybe I'm suppressing a fire. I'm suppressing removal of the trees, but I've changed how that forest might be by preventing whatever disturbance was going to come in and reset it. Or I remove woody vegetation. We get shrub encroachment in grasslands, and that might affect sage grouse. It might affect a number of grassland species. And so if I go in and I cut out all the brush, I remove the cedars in the range field in western Kansas, I am setting it back to an earlier cereal stage, and I'm doing it for wildlife, so they're all correct. Okay. Which of the following affects the nitrogen cycle? Remember, photosynthesis deals with the carbon cycle, and it takes in carbon dioxide and produces carbon locked up in sugars. So that one is out. Water moving over rocks is like, I guess it could maybe affect the phosphorus cycle. That's really about it. Condensation is just nothing. I mean, it doesn't affect any of these cycles really. It's just that symbiotic relationship between plants and bacteria, or the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that has a relationship with different plants, but not all plants. So it's the bacteria that fixes the nitrogen into a usable form that the plants can uptake, and then once they've uptaken it, something can eat the plants, and we can eat the something, or we can eat the plants, and we get that nitrogen. And then we die, or we poop, and the nitrogen cycles back through bacteria. So there were some videos produced by way better video people than me on that. Which of the following are reasons why species reintroduced outside their existing range are designated as non-essential experimental populations? So I've hit on this a couple of times. A non-essential experimental population means this population of this species is not, I hate to say it, but important to the overall population that we're trying to manage. It primarily relates back to the Endangered Species Act. So it says you can experiment on this group if you want. We are not going to put any regulations in place to keep this group alive. And that is helpful for a variety of reasons. One, if I want to reintroduce an endangered species, that means that I would carry with it all of the regulations that an endangered species has. I'm not going to get public support. But if I can say, we're going to reintroduce them, but they're going to be non-essential experimental. That means that if a rancher wants to shoot a wolf, then they're not going to get the same consequences as if you shot a wolf that was part of the mega population or the meta population of which you are protecting. The other thing is it might prevent a species from having to get listed if it's designated as that. So the main thing is it allows private landowners the ability to support like a reintroduction, and it allows for some adaptable regulations so that things aren't as strict. The other answers are just kind of bogus. Critical habitat is directly tied to endangered species. So if you have an endangered species, even if it's not in a site, if that site is critical habitat for that endangered species, regulations apply. You can't dig it up, plow it up, build on it if it's governmental land especially. And so it's kind of the opposite. It's like more weight is attached to that critical habitat. Okay, describe 2 important considerations before beginning your sample. I give everybody the points on this. So if you think your answer was right, and because you got the points, it might not have been. I just don't think that I covered this significantly, and it will not be on your final. The gist of it is you got to make sure before you sample that your data is going to be valid. So you need to think about your sample size in relation to the whole population, the whole area. You need to think about your design. Is it random? Is it stratified? You need to think about how many samples you're going to get, etc., etc. This is just basically a sampling design question, and it will not be on your final. Which of the following would not be an example of density-dependent populations? Okay, remember, density-dependent is that it's some kind of factor that will change based on how dense the population is. Okay, so for the first choice here, animals choose a less desirable habitat because of a high density of animals in the desired habitat. So we talked about that, where you have animals selecting for habitat B when habitat A is better, but the fact that so many other animals are in habitat A, they're going to move and choose the lesser quality habitat. I hate to use this, and I probably really shouldn't do it on video, but let's think about Fort Collins, for example. Great place to live, right next to the foothills, lots of trails, lots of restaurants, or at least there used to be, and so lots of things that might make people want to live here. But some people, right, might say, I would rather move to none, shouldn't call none less desirable, but then we'll just go with that. I'm going to move to Nunn, Colorado, where I don't have the trails and I don't have the restaurants, but I don't have to deal with all the people. That would be a density dependent factor. Okay, don't post that anywhere. Let's say animals choose elk producing lower numbers of calves because they are competing for food. Absolutely, that's density dependent. Reproduction is often density dependent. In fact, some animals will reproduce more because their populations got reduced and they're rebounding from that. But reproduction would be oftentimes density dependent. Now, a change in reproduction doesn't mean it's density dependent, but if you know that it's the competition for food that's driving the numbers of surviving offspring down, then it's density dependent. Animals choosing a less desirable habitat because of a territorial animal. So an alpha wolf has this territory, and he's going to make sure that no other males come in there, that this male might choose a less desirable habitat because he just doesn't want to get eaten. And then the density independent is flood. Like a flood might come no matter how many animals are there. And so because it's a factor that's going to happen just because it's going to happen, and it doesn't matter what the density of animals is, that would be a density independent factor. So if we reread the question, which of the following would not be density dependent? What I'm really asking here is, which one of these is a density independent factor? Okay, which of the following are dominant factors for successful dispersal? This was straight from your PowerPoint, but I can see the confusion here. So it's these top 3. The probability that when you leave your target patch, you're actually going to get there, all right? And there's some things that are going to play into that, right? But if you take off at the wrong angle, you don't hit it. If you have too far to go, you don't hit it. If you hit barriers along the way, you don't hit it. So they say it's the probability of hitting your patch times the probability of not dying along the way. So things like making a highway crossing, it might bring this probability of not dying on the way up. Like, great, there's a less chance they're going to die, so they might get there. But this plays into this. The number of highway crossings plays into probability of not dying. It's covered. And the probability of settling in an undesirable habitat, that also, it's these three things kind of multiplied together that gives you your chance of successful dispersal. How many young you have, not really that important. Which of the following describes wolverines in Colorado? Okay, so we had wolverines. We no longer have wolverines. So what's their status? There are wolverines in the United States, and on the planet. Okay, so the species still exists. So they're not extinct. That means the species no longer exists. Extant means the population is still living somewhere. But we asked about wolverines in Colorado, so they're not extant in Colorado anymore. Endemic means native to an area and only occurs there. So pronghorn are endemic to North America. They don't occur anywhere else in the world. That's an example of endemic. And so extirpated would be, so wolverines aren't endemic to Colorado because they occur other places and they always have. And extirpated means they were once here and they're not here anymore. For whatever the reason was, they were extirpated. And so that's the right answer. Wolverines, bears, or grizzly bears, I should say. Wolves were extirpated from Colorado, although they've come back on their own. And so they were extirpated, but they're not currently extirpated. Okay, capturing animals is very stressful. This is straight off your vocab list. This increase in heart rate, body temperature can cause the animals to essentially kind of freeze their muscles and they can't breathe and they die. So that's the capture myopathy. That can happen shortly after you capture, and that's why it's so important that you use Animal Care and Use Committee to review your methods, and they're going to look at the temperature limits that can be. If you're sampling animals in the wild, you can only do it usually at lower temperatures, and you have to tell how you're going to keep them from overheating or going into hypothermia based on your conditions so that you don't have some of these capture-related deaths. The rest of this stuff is just made up stuff, but I'm kind of proud of myself for making them sound like there's something. Which of the following is a type of plant that has a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria? We already went over that. Those are legumes. Managing wildlife habitat is essential to a healthy wildlife population. Give an example of how habitat structure is important. I'm not asking for just habitat in general. I'm asking for structure. So when we talk about habitat structure, we generally are talking about vertical structure, although you can have horizontal structure, which is just changes along the way. And if you can explain it, that's fine. But vertical structure might be like grass, a shrub layer, a tree layer. There you have differences in vertical structure. Different structures may be important for wildlife at different times in their life. And so why is structure important? Because it might provide openings for chicks. So we think about those pheasants. They want to be able to move under the understory. They want to be able to hide under the shrub or in the trees. And so there's some differing structures that make for improving wildlife habitat. I could probably reword this question and make it a little bit better, but the key here is thinking about what is habitat structure and why does that matter? Especially why might different structures matter to create really ideal habitat for a certain species. Non-invasive sampling, most people got this at least on their second or third time through, but make sure you pay attention. If I say 1, 2, 3, several, follow the instructions, okay? So 2 non-invasive, we have cameras, we have DNA sampling, we have hair snares technically is DNA, but I would have given that to you too. Scat samples could be DNA, it could just be surveying. Track samples, just observing, sitting and observing who's moving through. That's non-invasive for the most part. Chronic wasting disease is a prion disease. We just covered that recently. So if you're concerned about chronic wasting, go back to the last few lessons, including my talk on the Wildlife Research Facility that I gave you last week. Which of the following is often the limiting feature for critical habitat migrating on waterfowl? Okay, migrating waterfowl, what do they need? They need food for flight. That's carbohydrates, right? But that's not limiting. We have cornfields, we have wheat fields, we have carbohydrates everywhere. But what we don't have everywhere is protein and calcium. So they're almost getting there to nest. They have to fuel themselves to get there and still be able to nest when they get there. So our biggest limitations are invertebrates and protein. And how do you get that? You change your water level in a wetland system so that you can get different plants growing, so you can have different invertebrates living there, and you have a much richer food supply for those migrating waterfowl. Open water for resting, not in short supply. It's not a limiting feature in our landscape. It used to be, and when we talk about snow geese, we did just talk about this in my other wildlife class. Snow geese used to die a lot between Mexico and their Arctic wintering grounds because we didn't have all these crop fields and reservoirs and everything else. But we've changed our landscape so much that they've got everything they need along the way, and they aren't going down. Side note. Okay, in order to have an effective wetland system on the eastern plains, the key element you have to regulate is water, for the above mentioned reasons. And not just regulate water, it's really regulate water levels. So you can't just tell me ponds, rivers, whatever. You have to regulate the water levels. So you have to see a change throughout the season in order to get the desired critical habitat. Okay, this is asking what kind of species it is. So if we look at the graph, we have probability of occurrence on the left. So the higher that number is, the more likely they are to occur. And this is area forest. So the bigger chunk of forest altogether. And what this is saying is when we have a small chunk of forest, we do have a higher probability of occurrence than if we have a big chunk of forest. Otherwise, we'd see numbers up here. And it'd be a straight line if it was neutral. It didn't matter at all. If we had an edge specialist, we would see high numbers up here and a stark decline as you get into a bigger forest. So it's not the specialist. If it was a forest interior, we'd see really low numbers on the edge and we'd see high numbers in the forest interior. This is an edge associate. It's somewhere in the middle. It likes the edge. It does well and better than deep in the forest, but it's not all or nothing. Okay, shape of edge matters. The amount of contrast in edge matters. So having, maybe multiple layers of edge habitat, and then having a variety of different types of edge matters. Height doesn't matter so much. If you don't have to have tall vegetation. You can have short vegetation and still have edge. So those are what you're looking at there. Describe one conflict that might occur between humans and wildlife. Oh, okay. This one, a lot of people wanted to put all of the reasons why humans impact wildlife. No. For human-wildlife contact, we're talking about humans here, folks. What's the problem from humans? So stick to what matters for you, actually. Don't stick to what you're too kind-hearted. Stick to what matters to the general public, right? They know that the wolf is eating their livestock, and so they're mad. That's a conflict. The blackbirds are eating the corn, and so we can't harvest as much corn. That's a problem. The seagulls are eating the fish out of the raceways, so that's a problem. The bears are stealing trash or campers from campgrounds. That's a problem. All these are problems for humans, therefore they're a human-wildlife problem. Even if it's the humans that really are causing the problem, we don't care. We care that it was a problem for us. So don't give me reasons why, like habitat declines or something. That matters for the animal, but not for the human. Okay, we made it through. I would totally watch this in 2 times speed or break it up. But thanks for sticking with me. If you go through this, that should prepare you for our review session on Friday. And on Friday, I can take any questions about any of these that weren't clear or any other questions about content that you think you don't quite have a grasp on to prepare for the final. Thank you guys. We'll talk to you soon.